The air in Atlanta was a war zone of silence and dread. The dead shuffled endlessly through the streets, their guttural groans blending with the echo of faint gusts of wind. The sun, hammering down on the deserted city, seemed obscene in its brightness, casting long, sharp shadows that blurred the line between living and dead. High above the chaos, Glenn recrouched on the roof of a department store, his steady breath barely audible beneath the clamorous growls of the herd below. Survival had become second nature to him. His agility, his knack for moving unnoticed through the chaos, was all that had kept him alive this long. But survival now meant solitude. He was a courier, a shadow among ruins, ducking away from every stranger, even the living. On any other day, Glenn might have paused, might have reconsidered his self-imposed rule to avoid groups at all costs. He'd found that people, even good people, were dangerous. But today wasn't normal in the slightest. The raid had gone wrong. Supplies were sparse, and the dead were pressing harder against the city's borders. He felt vulnerable, exposed, and the weight of a single backpack slung over his shoulder wasn't enough to soothe the pit growing in his stomach. He knew he had been spotted by a cluster of walkers earlier, and though he had slipped away through a claustrophobic alley, there was no saying how far behind they were. Glenn's eyes darted to the fire escape that veered upward toward the roof of another building, and his instincts screamed at him to move. Adjusting his cap, he exhaled sharply, took hold of the ladder, and began climbing. It wasn't until he slipped over the final rung that he froze. Across the rooftop was something, or rather someone, he hadn't expected. A man, disheveled, pale, wearing a sheriff's uniform caked in dirt and stained with dried blood. Glenn stared at the figure for a long moment, noting his awkward limp and the blood-soaked bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. The man moved sluggishly, clearly dragging himself toward a nearby water tank for refuge. He was alive but barely. Glenn's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched back down. Strangers led to danger. That law had kept him breathing. Still, something gnawed at him. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, buried beneath layers of self-preservation. But before he gave it a name, an ear-piercing metallic clatter broke the rooftop's fragile stillness. A loose piece of piping, kicked by the stranger in his dazed few steps, had plummeted from the roof. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the concrete jungle, and in the moment that followed, Glenn heard it. The swelling groan of 100 walkers below, lurching toward the sound like moths to flame. The sheriff whipped around, his wild, pale eyes locking onto Glenn. He looked desperate, though not threatening. "Hey!" he rasped, his voice cracking from exhaustion. "Help me!" Glenn could feel the tension snapping tight like an overdrawn wire. His legs were frozen beneath him, locked in indecision. A piece of him wanted to turn back, retreat into the maze of alleys. He couldn't risk himself for this man, a stranger with no guarantee of safety. Maybe 5 or 6 months ago, back in the world that used to be, Glenn Rhee would have jumped at the instinct to help. But that man was a ghost now, someone he didn't even recognize anymore. I can't," Glenn whispered under his breath, half hoping the wind would swallow his words. But he turned away from the rooftop's edge, his stomach twisting in knots. He didn't dare glance back as the growls grew louder, closer. Not when the groans of command from the walkers suddenly merged into chaos. Glenn didn't stay to hear what happened next. He slipped back into the alleyways unnoticed, his movements fluid and sure as he disappeared deeper into the city. Whatever the sheriff's fate was, Glenn told himself it wasn't his concern. His hands clenched tight around the straps of his pack as he pushed thoughts of death and guilt into the back of his mind. He didn't look back. That was the point. You never looked back. But fate wasn't without cruelty. It delighted in the ripples made by even the smallest of choices. Unbeknownst to Glenn, the man he left behind had survived, albeit only by sheer luck. Rick Grimes fought through the onslaught of walkers, his mind a haze of adrenaline and agony. A few haphazard swings of a crowbar earned him enough distance to stumble away, escaping through the opposite end of the rooftop. Weak and too injured to fight for long, he staggered back into the maze of Atlanta, calling out desperately for the survivors, he thought he had been sent to protect. But no one answered. No one was left to hear him. Across the city, Lori tightened her grip on the makeshift barricade of chairs against the department store's glass doors. Each groan from the walkers pressing against the entrance shook her resolve. But she didn't let it show. Carl sat behind her, his wide, terrified eyes peering at the fortress they had made. "Will Dad come back?" he whispered in a tremulous voice. Lori didn't know how to answer anymore. The days stretched out endlessly. Shane paced behind them, armed with a bloody tire iron, muttering plans that seemed viable only in his desperation. If Rick didn't come back, their decisions would lean on Shane. And Shane was losing pieces of himself with each passing hour. By nightfall, panic settled over the camp like a wet fog. The weary group had no idea that their hope, the one they called Rick Grimes, was lying unconscious in a basement 3 blocks away, nursing wounds and waiting out the night. They only knew his absence invited despair, the fear that no one was coming for them anymore. Decisions grew reckless. Shane insisted they could make it, that the group could push out of the city on foot and bypass the hordes outside. He offered bravery, but it came with a knife edge of doubt. If he was wrong, if they were caught, the dawn rose gray and cold as the group made their ill-fated attempt. Walkers intercepted them before they could clear the narrow alleyways, their ravenous groans erupting like a storm in the early light. Every single step became a scramble for survival, every scream drowned beneath the crescendo of terror. From a rooftop in the distance, Glenn watched silently as the herd devoured what remained of hope. His hand reached unconsciously for the crowbar strapped to his side. His knuckles white as a deep, unfamiliar shame washed over him. He could have helped. Once, twice, even. But he hadn't. It was supposed to be easier this way, wasn't it? Survive because you had no choice. Save no one because no one else mattered. Until you looked back and realized the only thing heavier than a backpack was the weight of those you left behind. Glenn crouched in the shadow of a rusted SUV, its tires long deflated and its windshield webbed with cracks. The groans of the dead lingered in the air like a siren's call, pulling every nerve taut in his body. He'd scouted the alley thoroughly before ducking into it. His exits were clear, his escape route secure. Still, unease gnawed at the edges of his confidence, a splinter in his spine that refused to dislodge. He tried to shake it, but it clung to him like the stifling, humid air. In the distance, a guttural scream ripped through the city's symphony of mourning and decay, cutting short as abruptly as it had come. Glenn didn't flinch. He'd conditioned himself against reacting to cries for help. The living were unpredictable, dangerous. A lesson burned into him, etched like scars. Yet, his eyes moved instinctively toward the source of the sound, catching a glimpse of shadows shifting, flickering between the jagged silhouettes of buildings. He told himself to move, to slip away before curiosity drowned reason. But something rooted him in place. His breaths came shallow, his pulse pounding loud in his ears as memories stirred unwelcome in his mind. Faces, the group he had once run with before Atlanta went dark, a handful of survivors who had become both family and liability. They were the reason he stayed alone now. Too many lives on his conscience. Too many faces he couldn't remember without flinching. The sudden hiss of air shifting nearby broke his trance. He ducked lower, flattening himself against the carcass of the car, his hand instinctively wrapping around the crowbar strapped to his side. His eyes darted around, searching for movement. There, a shuffle of boots scraping against asphalt. Not walkers. No, the rhythm was too measured, too human. A boy emerged first, no more than 10 or 11. His thinning frame wrapped in a dirty camouflage jacket that looked 2 sizes too large for him. He was clutching a knife awkwardly, its blade shaking as he moved. Behind him, his mother staggered into view. A woman with gaunt cheeks and hollow eyes, one arm held in a makeshift sling. Glenn's heart stuttered in his chest. Not because of the state they were in, but because they weren't alone. A man followed, big, broad-shouldered, made harder by the bite of the world they were in. He carried a long-handled axe, its blunt edge crusted in dried blood. It only took one glance to understand what kind of weight this man carried. the way his head turned constantly, mistrust flickering behind his narrowed eyes. He kept them moving, checking every corner and angle with a predator's awareness. Glenn grimaced as his mind supplied the obvious conclusion. They didn't belong in the city. Not for long. These people were fragile fractures just waiting to snap. The group was retreating, Glenn realized. Their steps were too quick to be casual. The boy's knuckles were white around the handle of his knife as he clung to his mother's side. And then, slowly, Glenn became aware of the sound following them. It crept toward him like rising tide, low at first, then swelling. Groans cascaded through the air, warring with the grind of shuffling limbs and snapping cartilage. A herd was moving, far larger than the one that had swarmed Rick hours before. Glenn's stomach sank as he pieced it together. The loose clatter of that pipe, the noise Rick had inadvertently unleashed, it had set off a chain reaction. Strand by strand, walkers were unraveling the city's fragile quiet, drawn like predatory tides to any new thrumming pulse of movement. They were converging. The boy tripped. The mother dragged him forward, her free hand clutching at his arm, but her strength buckled halfway. The man turned sharply, his axe raised reflexively. As Glenn watched, his gut twisted. This man was their guardian, but his muscles looked like they were running on fumes. The mother was injured, and the boy's fear was practically choking him. None of them were going to make it if they kept running blindly into the labyrinth of dead. Glenn's body acted almost without thought. His fingers gripped the edge of the crowbar tightly, and before the sense of what he was doing could settle, he was moving. He slipped out from behind the car, keeping his profile low as he stalked toward the group. "Hey!" The sound left his lips before he could reconsider. They whipped around, the axe-wielder turning sharply toward him with a predator's reflex. The boy froze, his hands trembling around the knife, while the mother backed away protectively, though her steps were slow and exhausted. "Who the hell are you?" the man barked, suspicion wrapping tightly around every syllable. The hint of vulnerability in his eyes betrayed his hardened tone. "Doesn't matter. You're heading straight for a dead end," Glenn replied, his voice even but clipped. His eyes flicked to the growing shadow behind them, a crush of groaning corpses lurching into the narrow street. "That herd will catch you before you hit the next block if you don't follow me." The man hesitated, his shoulders lifting as though preparing to shove him away. "Why should we trust you? You don't have time not to," Glenn bit out. "Look, I don't care what you think of me. The streets are clogged, they'll box you in. I know a way that isn't." The mother gave the man a pleading look, her breaths ragged. "Gareth, we can't." Before her sentence finished, the dead surged forward, their collective groans swelling into a cruel crescendo. A wave of putrid bodies staggered into the street, forcing the group into motion. Glenn didn't wait for confirmation before turning back toward the rooftops that had saved him so many times before. They followed. Glenn led them quickly but carefully, never allowing their steps to grow careless. He pushed through jagged alleys and broken stairwells, their path a maze of sharp turns and dead ends repurposed into passageways. They eventually reached an abandoned factory on the city's edge. Its rusted shell loomed over them like a relic from another age, but the stillness of the air promised a refuge, at least for now. The man, Gareth, helped the mother collapse onto a pallet of wooden crates. Her chest heaved with shallow, uneven breaths. The boy sat beside her, his fists still clinging to the knife's hilt even as exhaustion bled from his body. Glenn turned to Gareth, his voice low but edged. "You need to slow down. Where the hell were you trying to go like that?" Gareth straightened, his head lowered just slightly in what Glenn recognized as reluctant gratitude. "Anywhere but here. Whatever plan we had, it's gone to hell." His gaze flicked to the woman, then to the boy. "We weren't going to make it much longer." Glenn nodded absently, though his mind churned. He had saved them, yes, but at what cost? Every decision had weight, and the cracks were already showing. The herd had shifted drastically, closing off routes that even he had relied on for survival. His haven of solitude suddenly felt less secure. These people had no idea how thin the ice was beneath them. "Stay here," Glenn said finally, motioning toward the boy and his mother. "Rest if you need to, but don't get comfortable. Things are unraveling faster than you realize. I saw it start hours ago." Gareth's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Glenn hesitated. He thought of the sheriff, his broken body dragging itself across that rooftop. He thought of the barricaded group he had glimpsed through department store windows. Splintered fragments of hope, or something resembling it, crumbling before his eyes. "I mean, the city's about to devour anyone who hasn't already run," he said finally, his tone like jagged steel. "And if you want to stay alive, you're going to have to decide what that's worth. Now." The silence inside the factory was deafening after the hellish cacophony that had chased them. Glenn leaned against a rusted metal beam, his chest rising and falling as the weight of what he'd done sank in. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The boy had fallen into a restless doze, his still clenched hands twitching against his lap. The woman stared blankly at the concrete wall, her good arm wrapped protectively around her son. And Gareth stood apart, a sentinel in their moment of quiet, his axe resting by his side but still within reach. Glenn eyed him from where he stood, the crowbar loose in his grip but ever ready. People, he reminded himself, were unpredictable, worse than walkers in their capacity for betrayal. Every scar on his psyche whispered that mistake back to him. And yet, something about Gareth was different. He seemed too weary to be dangerous, too broken by the weight he bore. That didn't mean trust, though. Trust was something Glenn no longer had to give. "You saved us," Gareth said suddenly, his low, gravelly voice cutting through the thick stillness. He didn't look at Glenn as he spoke. His eyes were fixated on the factory's massive double doors, as if watching for the return of danger. "I didn't do it for thanks." Glenn's words were sharp, deliberate. This wasn't a conversation he wanted. Not now. Gareth's jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffening at the response. He turned slightly, just enough for Glenn to catch the edge of the glare hidden beneath his exhaustion. "Yeah, I figured as much. Just a warning, man. If you're the type to play hero and then throw it back in someone's face, you're not as clever as you think." For a moment, tension hung thick between them. Glenn stared him down, his fingers tightening around the crowbar. Then he forced himself to let out a slow breath. "I led you here because I saw a herd moving toward you, and none of you looked like you had more than an hour left. That's it. I don't owe you more than that." Gareth barked out a bitter laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "Good, because I've got nothing left to give either. You think I wanted us here? You think I wanted to drag her and the kid through this damn city? You don't know the first thing about what we've been through." "You're right. I don't," Glenn replied coldly. "I don't know you, and I don't need to. All I need to know is whether your problems are going to get me killed." His words sliced through the air like a knife, but Gareth didn't argue. He only turned back toward the doors, his shoulders sagging under a fresh weight. Glenn let the silence return. His lips pressed into a thin, hard line as he considered the situation he'd put himself in. He told himself again that this wasn't his problem. They'd rest, they'd leave, and he'd move on, just like he always did. He hadn't needed anyone before, and he didn't need anyone now. But deep down, the gnawing pit in his stomach, the one born of regret, reminded him that survival wasn't the same thing as living. He could ignore the weight, the small cracks in his facade, but only for so long. "Hey!" A soft voice broke the silence. Glenn glanced over to find the woman watching him. Her face was pale, and though her features were worn, there was a flicker of gratitude in her glassy eyes. "Thank you for what you did back there." "Don't mention it," he mumbled, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "I mean it," she insisted, her voice rasping from dehydration and fatigue. "We've been running so long." Her gaze dropped to her son, and her words faltered. "I didn't think we'd make it out of the city, not like this." Gareth wouldn't admit it, but things were falling apart. Glenn studied her for a second, then sighed. Against his better judgment, he knelt beside her and pulled free a dented flask from his pack. "Here, small sips," he said, holding it out. She hesitated, clearly surprised by the gesture, but accepted it with a faint nod. "What's your name?" she asked after taking a careful sip. "Glenn," he replied quietly, his tone non-committal. Names didn't matter anymore, not the way they used to. "I'm Mary," she offered, her lips twitching upward in the ghost of a smile. She gestured toward her son. "That's Liam. And Gareth, well, you've already met him." A low groan echoed in the distance, cutting their exchange short. Glenn stiffened immediately, his head snapping toward the sound. It was faint, likely from one of the factory's outer corridors, but it was enough to send a chill racing up his spine. Gareth reacted too, gripping the handle of his axe as he moved toward the source. Glenn reached for his crowbar, his movements instinctual, practiced. "You two stay here," he said to Mary without looking back. The two men crept through the narrow passage at the edge of the factory, their steps muted against the cracked concrete floor. The groan came again, louder this time, accompanied by the faint shuffling of feet. Glenn's jaw tightened as dread clawed at his chest. They reached a corner where light spilled weakly through broken windows. A silhouette staggered into view, human, but unsteady. For a brief second, Glenn felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone else had survived long enough to stumble into their makeshift sanctuary. But as the figure stepped closer, the gashed throat and bloodied hands told a different story. "Walker," Gareth muttered, his voice low and grim. "One's nothing," Glenn replied, though he knew better. Where there was one, there were always more. Before they could act, another shadow emerged behind the first. Then another. Glenn's pulse quickened as his suspicions solidified. The herd, the massive wave of walkers that had swallowed Atlanta, was finding its way to them, piece by piece. "We can't fight them here," Glenn said sharply. "We need to go." "Go where?" Gareth snapped, his earlier weariness now edged with panic. "You said it yourself, this city's a damn maze. If we run without knowing where we're headed, we're dead." Glenn's mind raced as he backed away, doing his best to stay calm. He hadn't planned for this. He'd thought the factory would be secure, far enough from the noise to be safe. But nothing was safe anymore. He glanced at Gareth, then back down the corridor. "We draw them away," Glenn said finally, the words leaving his mouth before he fully processed them. Gareth frowned. "What?" "We split up, lead them away from here. If they focus on us, it gives Mary and Liam a chance to get out." "That's suicide. You're welcome to let them die, then," Glenn shot back, his voice biting. "Because if we don't do something, they won't last 2 minutes in here." Gareth stared at him, his jaw clenching. The weight of Glenn's ultimatum pressed heavy between them. Then slowly he nodded. "Fine," he said, gripping the axe tighter. "But if this goes sideways?" "Yeah," Glenn said darkly. "I know." They returned to the main room in a hurry. Mary's eyes widened when she saw their tense expressions, fear breaking through her exhaustion. "What's happening?" she demanded. "Walkers," Gareth answered bluntly. "A lot of them. We're going to draw them away," Glenn added quickly. "You and Liam need to get out as soon as it's clear. Head south. Stay in the open as much as you can. Don't stop for anything." Mary's face crumpled, her lips parting in protest, but Glenn cut her off. "This isn't up for debate," he said sharply. "You want to keep him alive? Then listen to me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, clutching Liam close. Gareth stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay quiet," he said, his tone unusually soft. "We'll buy you as much time as we can." Glenn didn't wait for goodbyes. He spun on his heel, leading Gareth back toward the shrinking corridor of safety. The groans of the herd grew louder with every step until it became an almost deafening tide. When Glenn and Gareth stepped into the fray, their weapons raised, Glenn allowed himself a fleeting thought. A hope, buried deep, that maybe, just maybe, his choices could still mean something, even in a world gone completely mad.